This is my series of my Rainbow Magic books. Starting with the Rainbow Fairies. Ruby the Red Fairy. Amber the Orange Fairy. Sunny the Yellow Fairy. Fern the Green Fairy. Sky the Blue Fairy. Angie the Indigo Fairy. Heather the Violet Fairy. Next is the Weather Fairies. Crystal the Snow Fairy. Abigail the Breeze Fairy. Pearl the Cloud Fairy. Goldie the Sunshine Fairy. Evie the Mist Fairy. Storm the Lightning Fairy. Haley the Rain Fairy. Next is the Jewel Fairies. India the Moonstone Fairy. Scarlet the Garnet Fairy. Emily the Emerald Fairy. Chloe the Topaz Fairy. Amy the Amethyst Fairy. Sophie the Sapphire Fairy. Lucy the Diamond Fairy. Next is the Pet Fairies. Katie the Kitten Fairy. Bella the Bunny Fairy. Georgia the Guinea Pig Fairy. Lauren the Puppy Fairy. Harriet the Hamster Fairy. Molly the Goldfish Fairy. Penny the Pony Fairy.
You need to redo this.
Next is the Fun Day Fairies. Megan the Monday Fairy. Tara the Tuesday Fairy. Willow the Wednesday Fairy. Via the Thursday Fairy. Felicity the Friday Fairy. Sienna the Saturday Fairy. Sarah the Sunday Fairy. Next is the Petal Fairies. Tia the Tulip Fairy. Peppa the Poppy Fairy. Louise the Lily Fairy. Charlotte the Sunflower Fairy. Olivia the Orchid Fairy. Danielle the Daisy Fairy. Ella the Rose Fairy.
You need to redo this.
Next is the dance fairies. Bethany the ballet fairy. Jade the disco fairy. Rebecca the rock and roll fairy. Tasha the tap dance fairy. Jessica the jazz fairy. Serena the salsa fairy. Isabel the ice dance fairy. Next is the music fairies. Poppy the piano fairy. Ellie the guitar fairy. Fiona the flute fairy. Danny the drum fairy. Maya the harp fairy. Victoria the violin fairy. Sadie the saxophone fairy. Next is the sports fairies. Helena the horse riding fairy. Stacy the soccer fairy. Zoe the skating fairy. Brittany the basketball fairy. Samantha the swimming fairy. Alice the tennis fairy. Gemma the gymnastics fairy. Next is the party fairies. Cherry the cake fairy. Melody the music fairy. Grace the glitter fairy. Honey the candy fairy. Polly the party fun fairy. Phoebe the fashion fairy. Jasmine the present fairy. Next is the ocean fairies. Allie the dolphin fairy. Amelie the seal fairy. Pia the penguin fairy. Tess the sea turtle fairy. Stephanie the starfish fairy. Whitney the whale fairy. Courtney the clownfish fairy. Next is the night fairies. Ava the sunset fairy. Lexi the firefly fairy. Sarah the starlight fairy. Morgan the midnight fairy. Nia the night owl fairy. Anna the moonbeam fairy. Sabrina the sweet dreams fairy. Next is the magical animal rescue fairies. The magical animal fairies. Ashley the dragon fairy. Lara the black cat fairy. Erin the phoenix fairy. Rihanna the seahorse fairy. Sophia the Snow Swan Fairy, Leona the Unicorn Fairy, Caitlin the Ice Bear Fairy, next is the Princess Fairies, Hope the Happiness Fairy, Cassidy the Costume Fairy, Anaya the Cuddly Creatures Fairy, Elisa the Royal Adventure Fairy, Lizzie the Sweet Treats Fairy, Maddie the Fun and Games Fairy, Eva the Enchanted Ball Fairy, next is the Superstar Fairies, Jessie the Lyrics Fairy, Adele the Voice Fairy, Vanessa the Geography Fairy, Miley the Stylist Fairy, Frankie the Makeup Fairy, Alyssa the Star Spotter Fairy, Cassie the Concert Fairy, next is the Fashion Fairies, Claudia the Accessories Fairy, Tyra the Designer Fairy, Alexa the Fashion Reporter Fairy, Jennifer the Stylist Fairy, Brooke the Photographer Fairy, Lola the Fashion Show Fairy, next is the Baby Animal Rescue Fairies, May the Panda Fairy, Kitty the Tiger Fairy, Savannah the Zebra Fairy, Nora the Arctic Fox Fairy, next is the Fairy Tale Fairies, Juliet the Sleeping Beauty Fairy, Lacey the Little Mermaid Fairy, next is the School Day Fairies, Lydia the Reading Fairy, next is the Storybook Fairies, Elle the Thumbelina Fairy, Mariana the Goldilocks Fairy, Rosalie the Rapunzel Fairy, Ruth the Red Riding Hood Fairy, next is the Friendship Fairies, Esther the Kindness Fairy, Mary the Sharing Fairy, Mimi the Laughter Fairy, Claire the Caring Fairy, next is the Showtime Fairies, Madison the Magic Show Fairy, Leah the Theater Fairy, Alicia the Acrobat Fairy, Darcy the Dance Diva Fairy, Amelia the Singing Fairy, Isla the Ice Star Fairy. Taylor the Talent Show Fairy. Next is the special edition. Holly the Christmas Fairy. Kylie the Carnival Fairy. Stella the Star Fairy. Shannon the Ocean Fairy. Trixie the Halloween Fairy. Juliet the Valentine Fairy. Mia the Bridesmaid Fairy. Flora the Dress-Up Fairy. Kara the Camp Fairy. Destiny the Rockstar Fairy. Belle the Birthday Fairy. Olympia the Games Fairy. Florence the Friendship Fairy. Cheryl the Christmas Tree Fairy. Brianna the Tooth Fairy. Autumn the Falling Leaves Fairy. Kira the Movie Star Fairy. Lila and Mila the Twins Fairies. Carly the School Fairy. Angelica the Angel Fairy. Skylar the Fireworks Fairy. Cyan the Butterfly Fairy. Carmen the Cheerleading Fairy. Alicia the Snow Swan Fairy. Last is Mermaid SOS. Misty to the Rescue. Ellie and the Secret Potion. Sophie Makes a Splash. Holly Takes a Risk. Scarlet's New Friend. Lucy and the Magic Crystal. Amber's First Clue. Katie and the Snow Babies. Megan and the Night Diamond. Jess Makes a Promise. Becky and the Stardust Locket. And Poppy's Last Chance.